Good morning. It's July 21st today, and we're in Romans chapter 7. And Paul has been talking about freedom from sin in Christ because we've died to sin, because we died with him when he was crucified. And now we're resurrected into new bodies and have freedom from sin. And he's continuing to talk about that here. But he also talks about the role of the law in exposing sin and actually even increasing sin for us, as he says at the end. He says at the very end of our passage for today, it was used. It used what was good to bring about my death, so that through the commandment sin might become utterly sinful. And I think that's an interesting concept that sin would become utterly sinful. We certainly invent new ways to do sin, but the law itself also helped us to understand what sin was, as um, Paul says he would not have known what it was to covet had the law said, do not covet. But then, as soon as it said, do not covet, his own flesh and mind created all kinds of new ways to covet. And I think that that's the truth for us too, that we're often introduced to new ways of sinning, and there is no shortage of that in us. And we seem to crave it and to seek it out. But the law exposes that in us, it brings it to the surface. It shows us that that's not just our own devices, but it's common to humanity that we all are prone to these kinds of things. And it shows us our desperate need for breaking of that sin cycle to be freed from that slavery to sin and then given an opportunity to be slaves of righteousness. So it's helpful, I think, that Paul walks through this for us, and his way of saying it is unique to that point, and it is very helpful for us, I think, as we look back at it. And it reminds me that Paul was a deep thinker, that he knew himself, that he knew his own sin, that he knew where he had come from, and that he also knew the great depths of grace and mercy that God had brought to him in redemption. And that was something that he celebrated and pondered and then talked about in writing and in person with people too. And so his exposition of this sin to the Romans, I think, is very helpful and has been helpful for centuries since that time. Obviously inspired by God too, and included in Scripture for us. So it shows, I think, the essential nature of every part of Scripture, that God would bring about somebody like Paul, cause him to be born, have the experiences that he had in his life, and then equip him to write this in a unique way, and then for it to be useful to us all these generations later. So very helpful little piece of scripture here in Romans chapter 7, of course.